What we're going to do today, though, is I'm going to show you some slides first to try to galvanize the concepts that we went through last time. And then we'll move on to this idea of the patellar tendon tap reflex. Now, last time we spent a lot of time about synaptic integration, thinking about how excitatory postsynaptic potentials that were graded or proportional to the number of ligand-gated channels that it opened would then work with the inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. How the inhibition and excitation would be working one against the other to regulate the output of that neuron by regulating the generation of action potentials at the trigger zone. That's pretty much what yesterday's or Monday's lecture was all about. And I'll run us through that again just in a couple of slides to try to drive that idea home. Then most of what we're going to do now, though, is we're now going to try to look at some real anatomy. We're going to try to begin thinking about circuits, how neurons interact one with the other. And the beginning of talking about a circuit is where we're going to talk about the patellar tendon tap reflex. And we use this as an example because the patellar tendon tap reflex is very simple. It's only two neurons. It's a primary sensory afferent taking information into the central nervous system from the periphery and a motor efferent carrying information out. This is really unusual. There are not many simple situations where we have a primary sensory afferent synapsing directly on to a lower motor neuron. But in fact, in this case, this is where we see this. Usually, there's an interneuron in between. So what we'll do is we'll lay this thing out. And this is something we're all familiar with. This is the tendon reflex, where when you go to the physician's office and they put you up on the gurney and the physician comes in and hits your knee, what they're doing is they're actually activating this patellar tendon reflex. And what we'll see is that there are sensory neurons in the quadricep muscle that when we stretch them, they're turned on. They fire action potentials. Those action potentials are carried from the periphery into the central nervous system. They're carried into the central nervous system on that primary sensory afferent. Well, that brings us to the idea of we're going to have to lay out the structure of the spinal cord. We have to lay it out in terms of the sensory in and motor out. And we've done this. We've touched on this before, but we're going to reiterate it here and try to put in some synaptic sites. Try to bring it round to the idea of how one neuron activates another. But one of the major ideas that will come out of that is that the reflexes are in fact confined to the spinal cord. These are entirely spinal cord responses. And you can, in fact, sever the spinal cord and still have these reflexes remain intact. But then, of course, that raises the question, how do we manage to get the information from the periphery into the central nervous system in the spinal cord and carry then forward to the brain? Well, we're going to describe that carrying sensory information into the brain in two pathways. We're going to describe it in something called the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, which is sometimes also known as the posterior column. The posterior or dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway will carry information about proprioception. Now, proprioception is a word that simply means we know where we are in space. It's a remarkable system. But any time as you're sitting there in your seat, or if you stand up, or when you walk across the room, you have a good idea where you are in space simply by this massive input from all of your muscles and stretch receptors, some in muscles, some in tendons, that are telling your brain how you're oriented with respect to the world around you. This is proprioception. It's really important to us. We use it all the time. And we'll describe a little bit about the pathway that's carrying sensory information from the periphery into the central nervous system, ascending through the spinal cord to the brainstem, to the thalamus, to the cortex. And we'll describe this pathway. Then, if there's time, we'll run through a slightly different pathway. The alternate pathway here is going to be one called the anterolateral system. The anterolateral system is the system which is carrying information from the periphery about crude touch. You can read pressure, pain, and temperature. So again, for us to recognize these forms of sensory input, this information has to be delivered to the brain. Has to be delivered to the part of the brain called the somatosensory cortex, and probably out to the parietal cortices as well, where we actually analyze the material, but your information. But all we're going to do up to this point is try to show the two different pathways of carrying the information to the cortex, and then we'll talk a little bit about that.